Hey everybody, it's the Jaywalker. Today, another Sunday morning mystery. It's episode 4. It's one that's kind of near and dear to the hearts of many a person here in northern Utah. One that garnered not only a lot of news attention here, but some nationwide. And it's one that is kind of notorious because of the way that it ended without much closure, but we'll get to that. But join me on the Jaywalk. Let's get into the case. So this is the Powell family. Wife Susan, husband Josh, and then children Charlie and Braden. Charlie being older by a couple of years, about 4 or 5 the time this picture was taken. So the case deals with the disappearance, of Susan. December 6th, 2009, Susan had taken the children to church earlier in the day. A neighbor had come over to do some crocheting or sewing with Susan, had left about 5 o'clock that afternoon. Later on that night, at midnight, we're talking December 6th, winter time. It's cold. It's a bad storm that's moving and or moved in. It's snowing. At midnight, Josh takes his sons camping out in the West Desert, close to the Nevada border. So somewhere between the Salt Lake area and Nevada. Just on a whim. No one didn't tell anyone. No one seemed to know until the next day when Charlie and Braden don't go to daycare. Susan doesn't show up for her work. So Susan's work, the daycare are trying to get a hold of Josh. They're trying to get a hold of Susan. Nothing. They eventually get a hold of some of the extended family, Josh's sister being one of them. And so they send a welfare check. So a little backstory. We'll stop and kind of get into a little backstory here. So both Josh and Susan were from Washington, around the Seattle, Tacoma area, just up in the northwest part of Washington state. After getting married in 2001, they briefly lived for maybe a year or so with Josh's dad. And Josh's dad kind of, not necessarily a great guy as things kind of turned out, but he had started developing some weird infatuation with Susan, and she wasn't having that, so she was like, we need to get out of here. So they end up moving out here to Utah, West Valley area, to kind of get away from that. That'll come back to play a little bit later on in the story here. So they move out here, set up life. Things are going normally-ish for the Powells. And so they were out here for 6 or 7 years. Josh and Susan welcome their sons into the world. Charlie and Braden. Charlie, as I mentioned, being the older one. So the story is, as I mentioned, Josh leaves to go on this camping trip, and at some point For some reason, Susan leaves, just disappears. Josh comes home, that after having this welfare check done, finding nothing in the house, nobody there. As I mentioned, Josh and the boys went camping. Susan's gone. Missing, but there are 2 Bucks fans blowing on one spot on the couch. Nothing really there to really show anything, but 2 fans blowing on a couch. Josh arrives back home, and they start to question him. He gives the story, I took the boys camping, I don't know where she is. And originally is cooperative, but as things move along, Josh becomes more and more uncooperative. He lawyers up. He begins to become a person of interest. Was never charged with anything, but a lot of things just aren't adding up. At some point, in the couple of days after Susan's disappearance, or maybe even that same day, Josh had rented a car and put like a lot of miles, like 500 miles. So a lot of miles within a day. Comes back, returns it. Upon questioning Charlie, the older son, he said, oh, wait, well, Mom went with us, but she just didn't come home. But again, a lot of just circumstantial, very weird, but very circumstantial things. Josh leaves, goes back up to visit his family in Washington, stays up there until early January, comes home, packs up his stuff, and moves him and the boys up to Washington. The investigation's still going on. Josh throws a couple of weird, dead-end leads at him, but other than that, nothing comes of this case. Part 2 coming up. So, Josh moves himself and the boys up to Washington. Moves into a house up in that Seattle area with his dad, his brother Michael, and one of his sisters. So, some of the things that go on is Stephen Powell, Josh's dad, is arrested and charged with voyeurism. He had been apparently recording women and girls that he lived close to. So with all of that, Steve goes to jail. And after he goes to jail, Charles and Judy Cox, Susan's parents, sue and are awarded custody of Josh and Susan's kids, Charlie and Braden. Josh was given notice that he could get custody back as long as he, followed certain things, and one of those was moving out of his father's house and getting his own place. And he did go and rent a place in a little town called Small Hill, just outside of Seattle. But the evidence was pointing that, yeah, he rented the house, but he wasn't living there. He was still living at his dad's house. So the Coxes were still had custody of the boys. Now, part of the deal here too is the police, and still trying to investigate this, they're looking out in the West Desert where places where Josh was known to camp, and different places around there, looking at old mine shafts, thinking maybe, their leading theory was that Josh had killed Susan in their home, wrapped her up, taken her, put her in the car, and taken the boys out for their camping trip, and had disposed of her in a mine shaft out in the West Desert of Utah, which is scattered with old mine shafts. So Josh is gone. Police also theorized that his brother Michael, who was living with Josh and their dad Steve, knew something about it. But again, anytime they brought him into question, him and Josh, they, of course, deny, and nothing ever came. And eventually this case went very, very cold. Even with spending more than $500,000 just on this investigation alone. So Josh loses custody of the boys, while his dad is awaiting court on the voyeurism charges. But he does have supervised visitation with them. In 2011, on one of these supervised visit days, Charlie and Braden are brought to Josh's house that he has rented in Small Hill by the DCF social worker, and as she's taking them up to the door, Josh is there waiting. He grabs the boy, shoves them inside, pushes her away, closes and locks the door, essentially locking her out. She does as much as she can. She calls 911, and hey, I'm supposed to be supervising this visit, and as she's on the phone with the police, behind her, the house, by all accounts, explodes. Not just burns, but it blows up, killing Josh and both of his sons. So a double murder-suicide. I won't go into much of the detail about some of the other things that Josh had done to the boys while, waiting to be unalived himself. But, yeah, just not the prettiest of things. So, Josh being the prime person of interest in Susan's disappearance and presumptively death, now the investigation into this, which was already running really cold, is pretty well dead in the water. In 2011, Steve goes to jail. He's released in July of 2011. In July of 2012, Stephen Powell dies, I believe, of a heart attack, or maybe cancer, but he dies of some stuff that's more natural. Michael, who police believe had knowledge, at least, of what went on. Even if he wasn't an accomplice, he knew what happened to Susan. He moved out to Minneapolis, Minnesota for graduate school, and in 2013, Michael committed suicide by throwing himself off of the top of a parking garage. Excuse me. So now the three people who most likely had any knowledge of what happened to Susan are all dead. Charlie, who had, at 5 years old, given some account, oh, hey, mommy came with us, but, she laid down in the trunk, but she didn't come back, is dead. So there's a lot more into the story. If you want more, really blow by blow into this, check out the podcast that was done by KSL. It's called Cold, C-O-L-D, Cold. It's the first season of that. It's fantastic. That's today's case. That's today's Sunday morning mystery. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you on another Jaywalk real soon.